Okay everyone, welcome to this event. Before we start and before we do introductions, I would like to acknowledge that this event and this exhibition take place on Wurundjeri land, and sovereignty was never ceded. And I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land and pay respects to elders past, present and emerging. We're delighted to be joined today by an illustrious panel of speakers. We have Cecilia Jimena from the Australian Red Cross, Damien Cave, Bureau Chief of the Sydney office of the New York Times, and award-winning photographer Adam Ferguson. Thank you all so much for being here today and sharing your knowledge with us. To start off, can you tell us a little bit more about who you are and what you do and where you do it?
Okay, I guess I'll go first.
Sure. Yeah.
Hi everyone. So I work for the Australian Red Cross. We're part of the international movement of Red Cross, Red Crescent societies. I've been with them for about 3.5 years, but my background really started in commercial research, market research, social marketing, behaviour change. So it was a bit of a step into the humanitarian world, although for over a decade I'd been doing a lot of work in the social sciences space. My role at Red Cross really is to help them understand the external environment so that we are making sure we are future-proof, future-ready to deal with the next set of disasters and catastrophic events that have long-ranging and significant impacts on humanity. There are other less illustrious parts to my role which are around performance, understanding how we track. A lot of people invest a lot of time and money into the work of Red Cross, and we want to be able to demonstrate the work that we do is having the impact that we intend. So that's, I guess, another area of my role. Is that kind of what you want?
That's great.
But I guess, you know, for Red Cross, a lot of people see Red Cross as bloods and floods. I mean, here in the audience, put your hands up when you think of Red Cross, what comes to mind? Is it disasters and floods and bloods, or is it yes? Am I seeing lots of nods? Yeah. When in fact the work of Red Cross is quite diverse, with Indigenous to homeless to people experiencing poverty, even those experiencing domestic violence. And so domestically our work is quite varied and I think a little unknown here in the domestic environment. But internationally, obviously, our emblem and the work of the International Federation of Red Cross in times of conflict, I think that is the kind of lasting image that people have of Red Cross.
Great,
my name is Damien Cave. As you can see, I'm an American. I've been here for 2 years. I opened the bureau in Sydney, which was the first New York Times bureau to open here since World War II. Our goal is really to cover Australia and the region in a way that is both global and local, that serves readers here and around the world. If we have a mission statement, it's one that I refer to often, is that our goal is to reveal Australia to itself and to the world. But prior to this, I've spent most of my career as a foreign or national correspondent. I worked for the New York Times. I'm proud to say I've spent very little time in the New York Times office in New York. So prior to here, I was in New York for a bit. Prior to that, I was in Mexico City, covering the drug war, covering the border, covering Latin America, from Cuba to Central America. Prior to that, I was in Miami, also doing a bit in the Caribbean, covering, at that point, it was the election of Obama in 2008. Prior to that, I was in Iraq covering the war during what was pretty much the most violent period. Ran into lots of Australians there, not surprisingly. And prior to that, I was in New York, but I started my career, at a small newspaper for a little while, then moved into writing for a digital outlet, and never really thought I'd be in newspapers. I've spent most of my time trying to sort of figure out what journalism is becoming and trying to make sure that we're innovating and staying fresh and trying to do new things differently. To some extent, this exhibit is an example of that. We believe journalism has many forms. Sometimes it's what you see on your phone, sometimes it's an exhibit that you go through. And whatever helps people understand the world is something that the New York Times is trying to do. So that's our mission, that's our goal, and that's me. And I've worked with this guy in a bunch of places as well, so I'll turn it over to him.
My name's Adam Ferguson, and thank you for coming, everybody. I was born in Dubbo and grew up in New South Wales. I moved to Coffs Harbour as a teenager and discovered photography in my early 20s and knew very much that it was something that I kind of wanted to devote my life to. It was an instant passport to kind of get out and explore the world. I didn't really have any ambition to end up working as a journalist per se, but the stories that I found myself gravitating towards as a photographer were very much social stories and political stories. I also graduated university at a time when there was no jobs in media, which was super disillusioning for me. And my response to that was to jump on a plane and kind of take off into the world. And I did that 17 years ago and I've never really moved back to Australia. So I live in New York City now. I've been freelancing for the New York Times for about a decade, but I also freelance for the New York Times Magazine, the New Yorker, National Geographic, and other publications. Most of my work has been focused around conflict. I really started my career in Afghanistan and have been back 30 times and was there 2 months ago. I've also worked extensively in Iraq. I've worked with Damien in Papua New Guinea and all around the world at this point. Yeah.
Thank you. So down to brass tacks, we're here to talk about the exhibition and to get your different points of view and reactions to it. I'll go by topic, and I've got questions sort of in every topic area for each of you. I might read them all out and then we can let the conversation per topic flow from there. So bear with me. So in terms of hard truths, I think it's fair to say in the world and in Australia, we're spoiled for choice. I don't know why I'm smiling, that's not a good thing. Sure, of course, yeah, we'll try to project, thank you. So in Australia in particular, I'm thinking about Manus, which was recently covered by Damien in the Times, the despair and escalating suicide rates there, drought in rural Australia, which Adam covered for Time magazine, the recent bushfires in Queensland, which I know both of you are involved with, murders of young women in Melbourne, including Yuriditchi Dixon and Aya Masarwe. With so much to choose from, Adam, I'm interested in how you and the curatorial team decided what photographs to include in this exhibition and which hard truths you would identify your photos as speaking to. Cecilia, from your point of view, I'm wondering, how do you allocate your resources to so many communities in need? And Damien, how do you and the New York Times decide what to cover? Maybe we could start with Into the Outback.
Sure. I think it's an organic journey most of the time for me. I think we live in a media climate where we tend to be so focused on everything else that's been reported. It's very easy just to kind of fall into the status quo. And I think as a photographer, which is obviously a very different process to say a writer, but my method is to get out there and see what's on the ground and let the narrative kind of form itself. The work that I did in Australia, for me, was really an inquiry into, what is the bush these days? The work came out of a place of being quite personally disillusioned with working internationally, and I did what every storyteller does, I think, when they hit a point of disillusion in their career, and that is to kind of return to their home and make sense of it. And I was born in Dubbo. My mother was from a small town in regional Australia, so that's kind of where it started for me. I think the premise of it was to try and deconstruct, what the bush or the outback is. I think, we live in a developed, multicultural Australia now. More than 80% of our population kind of lives between like the Sunshine Coast and Melbourne. Yet we still have this fondness for the bush. The outback is kind of ingrained in, our political culture through, the sentimentalism around Australian farming and people that live in the bush. Yet I think there's a big kind of disconnect between what the bush is and what the cities are, what modern Australia is and what old Australia is. So the work I did was really an inquiry into see what the bush is. I didn't really have any, the main themes that I kind of looked at were centralisation, climate change, mechanisation, and the kind of decline of country Australia, which is really a a global theme and something that most countries on the planet, especially developing countries, are experiencing at a really rapid rate. So there wasn't really a plan. As far as the methodology went, I embarked on the trip kind of in homage to the Great American Road Trip and the original photo essayists that started traveling across America and photographing, like, you know, the late Robert Frank, who just died actually 2 days ago, who did the pivotal The Americans. And that was really my kind of source of inspiration. And every time I got lost on that trip, I actually would look at The Americans. So I just started moving. I had very kind of clear, sorry, not very clear. I had a producer that I started working with who was setting me up subjects along the way, but it started to feel a bit contrived. So I ended up just turning up in small towns and seeing who wanted to talk. And that kind of organic, spontaneous nature really became the way that the trip unfolded for what ended up being 3 months. I was supposed to photograph for a month, and it just snowballed into this kind of 3-month mission, and I drove about 24,000 kilometers.
Yeah.
Just to answer the question about priorities, I mean, one of the really great things about the New York Times is that it's not as rigid as you might seem. It will allow someone like Adam to spend 3 months on a story, and so there's an openness to serendipity and to telling stories that, you know, maybe aren't already being told, and there's a desire to do that. But I also think that we look for, similarly to what Adam did, you know, themes that speak to global areas of concern, or, you know, we really see ourselves as a global news organization. And so, you know, our publisher talks about how many stories there are in the world that are now borderless stories. You know, migration is no longer just a national story, it's an international story. Climate change, technology, populism, these are all stories that are playing out all over the world, and that, you know, we believe we're in a unique position to be able to tell. And so the challenge is trying to figure out how to make these things come alive in a way that both fits that global narrative, but is also particular and based on that local knowledge that you have as a correspondent in that place. And, you know, foreign correspondence, like journalism, has changed a lot over the past few years. I think it used to be writing for the audience back home. Whereas now I think we write for multiple audiences, and we feel accountable to the audiences in the places we cover in a way that's deeper and I think important, and I think improves the journalism.
I just want to press a little bit further in terms of the inclusion of the Outback photos in this exhibition and how they speak to the other photos. There are some pictures of, you know, severe crisis and war-torn imagery, and how do you think that the Outback photos speak to the exhibition text, which says things like, you know, these photos were very difficult to take and they were hard places to be in. In terms of your photos, like, how do they speak into the broader context that they're included in here?
Yeah, good question. I think they speak to the larger narrative of the exhibition because they really get at a harbinger of issues that we're all going to face as a society, and a global society, not just an Australian society. And that is drought, and how we kind of make sense of a country which is becoming increasingly more arid. So while they're not as dramatic as some of the civil unrest and the conflict in the other images, I think we look at a place that's in decline, and it's a glimpse into something that's kind of fleeting and just there, but it's something that we're going to have to deal with as a nation.
Yeah, I would say too, I mean, there's a conception that, you know, and many of us who've covered conflict zones, that, you know, that crisis only comes in one form. It's the earthquake in Haiti that I covered, or, you know, it's wars. But the truth is that there's a lot of things that have crisis potential, and one of the great challenges is that.
Sometimes they speak more quietly.
Yeah, exactly. And it's important to cover all of them.
And sometimes there's a multiplier effect. So, you know, I think the question you posed to me was around how does Red Cross make decisions?
Yeah, especially with limited resources.
With limited resources, but the reality is that the vulnerability and needs, not only domestically but globally, as you guys would have seen, you're at the coalface and you're taking images of these things. You know, Red Cross is in there, boots and all, actually trying to address the impacts and the consequences of people who are experiencing dire vulnerability. And so for Red Cross though, I believe that as a humanitarian organisation, its tenets and its mandate really hold it true to its cause, which is to provide support and relief to those who are most at risk of or are experiencing vulnerability, and to do so with complete impartiality, independence and neutrality. And those things are the things that really put Red Cross in a good stead to deal with some of the consequences of conflict or the consequences of forced migration. You know, the emblem of Red Cross is a protected emblem, because when you see the Red Cross in a time of conflict, you are supposed to be hands off, don't shoot. Now we know that the changing nature of war and conflict, we are now seeing people with the emblem being purposely attacked. And so all of these things make it particularly difficult to try and operate in environments where there are a number of things that are occurring. And here in Australia, when we think about drought is just one of the many multiplier consequences of climate change. Right. And so, you know, drought causes food shortage, lack of water causes conflict. We have countries who are warring with each other over natural resources, and we are only going to see this escalate. So in terms of how does Red Cross manage its resources, where do we go? Well, I'd like to think that we go where we're most needed, and we go where no one else can. Right? If you think about the emblem, it gives Red Cross entree into areas or into situations that no other organisation can go because of that neutrality. I mean, that's why it has an observer seat at the UN, one of the only humanitarian organisation that has that. And so, you know, there's not enough humanitarian aid, there's not enough humanitarian dollars. The work that you guys do, you know, shines a light on these things that previously others would not have seen. But that 24-hour cycle of newsworthiness, I kind of think has other kinds of detrimental effects as well, which is, you know, desensitising and so on. Here in Australia, you know, there are lots of worthy causes. How do you choose? Well, I think we have to be really focused on, I thought I was loud enough. You have to be really focused on what are the core needs, who's best placed to provide the supports and services that are needed, how best can we optimise the scarce resources that we have, and who can we partner with to try and leverage to try and address some of these issues, because they're so complex and they're so interrelated. No one entity can solve these.
I'm going to come back to the way in which you guys, as members of the press, and you as a member of the Red Cross interact. But first I want to talk about, we've talked a little bit about what to portray, what to talk about. I want to talk about the way in which those items are portrayed. And the chat we had just before this event, Cecilia, makes me really interested in what you have to add to this. The Hard Truths exhibition text, which you guys will see as you walk in, behind us here once the exhibition opens today, asks us whether news photographs belong in a gallery exhibit, and whether, if by displaying them in this way, we're aestheticizing human tragedy. So in those sentiments, there's a sense that we're making pain too pretty and then showing it off in the cool of the gallery, which is another phrase from the exhibition text, is to make art as opposed to photojournalism, and to make light of calamity. But on the other hand, you could also say sometimes that bringing an artistic approach to photojournalism, especially that covers difficult content like this, can magnify the power of images to tell their stories and to express respect for the subject. So Adam, I'm thinking of the portraits you took of Nigerian schoolgirls who had been kidnapped. You said that you did that in a staged, cinematic way, drawing on inspiration from fashion photography. And the results are pretty amazing. Some of them include video, so that the woman's eyes actually rise up to meet you as you're looking at them. You said that you took that approach in order to invest them with dignity. And it really does succeed, I think, in avoiding reducing them to their victimhood. In terms of this exhibition, what kind of stylistic choices did you make when you were deciding how to take your photos?
Firstly, I think it's okay to aestheticize. I mean, every form of storytelling does that, whether it's, film or literature. So I think there's been a conversation historically about whether it's okay to make artful images out of marginalized people. And I think it's okay to. I think, as a storyteller, we all have a responsibility to embed the integrity of that story. But, a lot of photographs that we see that are made, artfully, aren't necessarily pretty. I think there's a lot of aesthetic choices which go into photography, and prettification is I don't think a very valid kind of term when you talk about photojournalism or documentary photography. And I think we have to look. It's very important that we engage with these issues, and photography is just one medium that brings us to that. So I love to defend the role of being a documentary photographer and sharing those stories, regardless of how hard they are. The choice that I made in going into the work that I did in Australia, and actually I'll just wind it back a little bit to the pictures that you suggested, brought up in Nigeria. I made a set of portraits of young women that had been strapped with suicide bombs. They'd been kidnapped. They'd been by Boko Haram. They'd been strapped with suicide vests and sent off on a mission to blow themselves up. And instead of blowing themselves up, they had the extraordinary courage to find help and not follow through with their mission. Most of the suicide bombings in northern Nigeria at the moment are carried out by young women. And what the choice I made when I went into this story was to negate the narrative of these people being victims. And I think that's always the role, whether it's the Australia work that I did or any other work, it's to look at what's been done and try and somehow push the needle. So with that work in particular, I didn't want to go in and make pictures of these young victims who'd been marginalized and looked like they were in poverty, like a lot of the other pictures that I'd seen come out of Nigeria. So I very much drew on fashion and artistic references to try and present the women as beautiful and courageous, with a huge amount of dignity.
And I love the sense that you get in those photos that they participated in the process of being portrayed. Which reminds me of what you said about your Outback photos and how you went in and let the stories that people wanted to tell you emerge, and then base your photos on that.
Working in Australia, because it was such a huge, expansive story and it wasn't really tied to one particular story or one news event, I very much went in trying to pull an image which was a metaphor or an archetype of the bigger theme that I was photographing. So I spent time in Indigenous communities, and the picture that I chose from the edit, despite having hundreds of photographs of Indigenous Australians, the picture that I chose was of the young man or the young boy, I should say, in the back of this vehicle, in this kind of bush landscape, which was his land. So to me, that was a metaphor for a young Aboriginal Australian caught in this kind of Western structure and moving through his own space. And that was the process constantly when I was traveling. It was always about finding one image out of every situation that spoke to a larger metaphor or archetype, rather than making kind of literal great pictures, if that makes sense.
Cecilia, do you want to jump in and talk to what you were saying before about the Red Cross's approach to images, the style of images you choose to show, and what you were saying about the style of images you choose no longer to show, and what the theory is behind that?
And again, remembering that the work of Red Cross and how we engage with communities and the way that we communicate is very much guided by our fundamental principles. And so, I'm kind of conflicted about some of these things personally, because the need to spotlight and to show many of these things that are going on in the world that the average person wouldn't necessarily know or see or hear is clearly there. And then the other side of me is often dismayed because the way they are portrayed is one of abject poverty and which they are in, of course, but it often misses the courage and the bravery and the resilience that these people also are demonstrating. So, you know, hats off to you for having that as your focus. For Red Cross, we've moved away purposely from showing images of starving African babies with the big bellies and the flies hovering around them, because these images aren't portraying the sorts of courage and bravery that I mentioned before that these communities are having, and to survive these types of things. And so our focus is very much a strength-based focus. So we want to show the stories of bravery, we want to show the resilience, we want people to see that there is a resolution, there is a solution to some of these really big complex problems that quite often the average person thinks, what can I do? What impact can I have? What is it that I could possibly do here in Australia that would make a difference? And so these types of images are reinforcing the negative stereotypes that are being projected over and over again. And that's not to say that that imagery isn't necessary. And often I think it's about the narrative that sits around that imagery. Right, so, you know, the other thing that dismays me is when I see headlines that say an avalanche of illegal immigrants arriving on Australia's shores. And if you unpack that, and if you apply objectivity to it, you know, 80% of all people entering into Australia come by plane. It's not illegal to seek asylum. There isn't an avalanche or a tsunami or other types of emotive words that are used. In fact, Australia has one of the lowest intakes of asylum seekers. And the imagery that goes with that kind of reinforces the sorts of language around that. So we're very careful and very mindful of what we do and how we present the communities that we work with. Our focus, I mentioned, is about working with, supporting others, supporting communities to grow their capacity and their capability to be able to self-determine and to help them resolve issues for themselves. You know, gone are the days of that kind of paternal, well hopefully, that kind of paternal sweeping in of foreign aid and we know best, we will fix this, and then flying off again for things really to just continue the way they are. So I think, and I hope, you know, journalism, and if I'm assuming many of you in the audience are wanting to be journalists into the future, you know, there's a huge responsibility that is on the shoulders of journalists and media, because the average Joe is getting their information from the media. You know, a piece of research we did recently which looked at humanitarian values and how they play out in the Australian context. Majority of people get their information from friends, family, media, whether it's print, whether it's TV, whether it's online.
I want to touch on what you said about the importance of the narrative that accompanies photos, particularly turning to Damien as a writer. I know this exhibition, on the one hand, is about taking the photos, giving them a lifespan, drawing our attention to them in a sort of isolated environment, whereas normally they appear in a transient daily newspaper context. But at the same time, I find that, you know, when you look at the captions or when you look at the accompanying stories, it really does illuminate them further. Damien, in your writing, in your articles, how do you feel about, you know, how do you make decisions about whether to adopt a certain tone, you know, a more distanced, fact-based journalistic tone, or a friendlier human interest approach? How do you make decisions when you have an image that you need to attach a narrative to? What are the kinds of thought processes that go into your decision-making around style and the ethics of that?
Good question. I mean, I could probably talk for 2 days.
Yeah,
on that one,
right.
But,
on all of these questions.
Exactly. But I mean, one of the things I will say is, you know, journalism for a long time was focused on this term called objectivity, right?
Yeah,
and there's
right.
a sense of distance, and in political coverage in particular, I think that's vitally important. For the kind of work that we do, whenever I talk to journalism students, I often tell them, don't be afraid of emotion. And there's a difference between editorializing and saying, okay, this is not just a problem, but I know the solution, and being able to be sensitive and empathetic and make sure that your writing actually reflects the emotions of the scene and captures these people, you know, from 360 degrees. And so, you know, I think the more you do this, the more you see dignity and agency in the lives of people. I'm reminded of the story I did with another really great New York Times photographer, Damon Winter, after the really bad earthquake in Haiti. And it was a story about all these women who were having babies in the days just after the earthquake. And we spent a bunch of time with we met this woman as she was having her baby, and then we went back to the house with her, and we spent a whole bunch of time with her. And in addition to all the challenging things she was dealing with, you know, she had neighbors who were bringing her food. She had a vision for how to improve her family circumstances. And she just was everything beyond a victim, even as she was a victim. And so the story that I wrote, you know, really tried to capture not just the difficult circumstances, but a bit of her sense of humor and the sort of interactions with her other kids, and trying to make sure that this was a full human and not just someone who was defined or reduced to the suffering of this circumstance. So that's something I think about a lot, is what, you know, like I often ask people I'm interviewing, oh, well, what's your favorite song? Or, you know, what do you love to read? Or just things to sort of understand someone at a level that goes beyond whatever it is, the news event that I'm covering. And I often find that helps people open up and builds a sense of trust as well. But I also think it's okay to emote even within these circumstances. You know, like there are times when, if you're good at this and if you feel as deeply as, you know, I think you were allowed to feel as a journalist, where sometimes you will cry in those circumstances, and sometimes that's okay. And it's okay to be angry, it's okay to be outraged. You just have to find a way to control those emotions when you're writing, and use them in a way that serves the story as opposed to serves yourself. And so that's the way I think about it.
I'm thinking in particular about, I heard about the wallabies being killed in Queensland on the news, and had very little reaction to it. And then I read your article, and
that was a little one.
I was like, thanks a lot. No, there's a bit about the baby Joey trying to climb back into its mother's pouch. And for me, that moment of emotion magnified the amount to which I suddenly cared about the story. And I think that's
you can even do it for animals, apparently. But I don't know, it is, I mean, I also think that, you know, to your point, journalists have a responsibility, and the reason I talk about emotion as being important is our job is not just to inform, but I also believe, especially in this moment when everyone just wants to retreat into their own country, it's also to make them connect with a wider world and connect with people who they might perceive as different, but in many ways share similarities. And so I think the only way you can do that is to really be in touch with the emotions and the full range of who a human can be.
Just grabbing that.
And just to add to that, look, I really think that you know, journalists have a pivotal role to play. You talk about creating that you know, that emotive connection. We know through many years of research, for people to act, to be inspired to act, to respond, to do things differently, they must feel proximity. You must create proximity to an issue. And so if you recall that horrific image of that poor lad that drowned. In Greece.
Lesbos in Greece, yeah.
That invoked such proximity to people who could never put themselves into the shoes of someone seeking asylum. And so that created proximity and connection to people from all walks of life. And I think we failed to capitalise on that. So if you can create connection, if we can create proximity, we are a step closer towards an inspiring action. And you know, the resolution or solutions to many of these problems will come from humanity, will come from the power of people. I don't want to get up here and preach, although I think I'm sounding a little bit that way. But I truly believe that we need to inspire action, right? Inspire a movement, and you guys can play a massive role in doing that in the right way. But equally, fascism did it in its own way. And so, and here is, I think, the dilemma and the fine line that often is played, because I appreciate the need to get circulation. There's a commercial imperative. These sorts of stories sell. And so, you know, I often wonder what's the kind of guiding moral compass that the media have?
It's a good question. I mean, I don't know that they do sell. You know, frankly, like people want to read about themselves. You know, stories that are about Instagram do really well. You know, because everyone is on Instagram. That's what they care about.
Yeah.
And so I'm actually not at all sure. I think there's an enormous challenge, especially in this moment, to make people care and think about these things.
so.
Now, there is a perception that, oh, you know, there was an old saying in American journalism: if it bleeds, it leads. So, you know, violence and voyeurism of violence. You know, all you have to do is watch the TV news in any country to know that that's something that can work for journalism. But I do think that the choices, at least at the New York Times, you know, we try to see things from a pretty broad perspective, and the New York Times does more and more kinds of coverage now than it ever used to. I mean, we'll tell you how to clean your living room and you know what's going on in ISIS territory. And so I think increasingly media has changed where we have more feedback from the audience, and so the challenge that I see going forward is when you give the audience what it wants, because we actually know what they want, versus when we show them what we believe that they need
to see.
and trying to find that balance. And that includes, you know, political pressures that come with, you know, once you're based and dependent on subscribers, what do subscribers want you to do? And so the financial imperatives change, and it is challenging, but I do think that, you know, the last thing I'll say is, one of the things I've found covering difficult places is the Times in particular, and I'm curious, you probably agree with this too, errs on the side of caution. If you have a doubt about a story, it holds. Like it doesn't push into that space. Like it, and so I think that there are certain standards that certain organizations come to rely on as checks. It doesn't mean we're perfect, we're far from it, but those standards and practices like really matter in these difficult times. But photography is actually a really interesting question with this too. And the Times has had to make a whole bunch of difficult decisions about, you know, how much blood and gore you show, and I'm curious, you know, if you've felt, Adam, that sometimes it either goes too far or not far enough. Sorry, now I'm throwing questions.
No,
I'm
it's
used
a
to
great
this.
question.
Yeah.
I think, I mean, the Times has always been very brave with choices, which is why I've maintained a relationship with them for a long time. I've definitely worked for other news organizations, which I won't name, who have erred on the side of caution when it comes to showing graphic images of important stories. And I do believe it's important to show the gore. I don't think we should self-censor, especially when it comes to our own. I think, you know, we're very quick to show gory images of marginalized people, but when it comes to showing gory pictures of a US serviceman or, you know, an American or Australian civilian, we tend to go, oh, it's too much. And I think that power dynamic shouldn't exist. And just to, I had a thought earlier in that conversation about kind of the role of journalism and you know how important it is. One of the interesting things that I have been experiencing lately as a photographer is that I think early in my career working, I was always welcomed as a photojournalist, and especially when I drop a name like the New York Times. Everyone was very, very willing to have you come and tell their story. It was much easier to develop a level of intimacy, and I definitely feel in the last kind of year or two, I'm noticing this kind of, oh, you're a journalist. There's not that same welcoming attitude, and we've all heard the fake news kind of term thrown around, and this kind of look at, or the view that journalists can somehow be up to kind of no good. And I think that's something that we have to be really mindful of.
That's a good point.
And it's something that, I'm seeing more and more. Instead of people being willing to share their story, they're much more skeptical of why you're there.
It's exactly what I wanted to ask you next. So I'll just grab the mic so I can project. But I wanted to say, we've been talking a lot about, you know, what to write for audiences out there, you know, what to publish, who to speak to. Cecilia, you touched on the neutrality of the Red Cross and being welcomed everywhere. But for you, Adam, and for you, Damien, I can imagine, and you've just mentioned this, that you are not welcome everywhere. And I wonder about if you can talk a little bit about, you know, how communities that you're photographing or writing about react to the coverage, and whether and for what reason there might be resistance to the coverage, and how do you, when you go into a place, make sure that people consent to the coverage and that it reflects or respects the way in which they would like to see themselves and their community portrayed.
I'll take this one, then I'll hand it to you.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, two points I would make on that. One, people often don't actually understand how journalism works, and this is a fault of our industry for not really explaining that when I go into a community to tell the story, I work for the reader. I don't actually work for that community. And they need to understand that I'm going to speak to the community, and then I'm going to speak to the community's critics, and then I'm going to speak to experts. And my job is to tell the most accurate, richest story I can tell from every possible perspective.
Yeah.
So get rid of objectivity, that's bullshit, that's not how we all live, but fairness is very important.
Yeah.
And I think you have to elevate fairness and explain to people that that's the goal. The second more practical thing I would say is that your interactions with these people, like I definitely think it's important to involve them in the story to the extent that they can be. So especially people who are not politicians, who are not media savvy. One of the things that I do, especially in vulnerable communities, or just people who are just not used to what journalism is I promise them, listen, I'm going to come back to you before publication, and I'm going to read this stuff to you. And I'm going to make sure you know what's coming before it publishes. This isn't to give you a chance to change your quotes or change what you said, but to make sure that what I have is accurate, and so that we can talk it through before publication. Because one of the things that I think happens is that people, as this distrust intensifies, it's often because they're surprised and they didn't know that that's what was coming. And so it takes more time and it's more work. But I used to do it only once in a while, like when I wrote about, this soldier whose son had PTSD and died, and there's really sensitive stuff. But now I find that I'm doing it much more often because the level of distrust has just gotten so bad.
Right.
And it works. I mean, once in a while, people push back on things harder, on things that just because it's a little embarrassing, and then I have to sort of explain, well, this is why I made that choice, and sorry. but it's much better to have that conversation before than after publication.
I think, Damien and I's processes are totally different as a writer and a photographer. I'm not articulating a longer narrative and saying you said this or these things happened in a kind of longer form. So I personally, as a photographer, I feel very much accountable to the people I photograph, and that's kind of it. And I always see it as my role to do service to that story and shepherd that story into a public space and try and capture as best I can the integrity of that story. Despite this exhibition being called Hard Truths, I don't believe photography captures any form of truth. It's a total interpretation, and I actually try and channel as much bias as I can, but do it with integrity to the story. And then, of course, once photographs are out in the world, I actually don't have any control over how they're perceived anyway. And that's a longer conversation. But yeah, I mean, I can make a picture with every intent, and an audience can take something else away from it also.
Which happens more and more. I think the way social media works, like there's arguments that develop, often far beyond the context of where things first appear, especially with imagery.
Just to explore the question of mutual influence a bit more between press and a humanitarian organisation like the Red Cross, you've talked a bit, Cecilia, about the importance of the communities you work with and the issues you attend to being highlighted in the press. But I wonder, Damien and Adam, how much of a motivation it is for you personally. We talked a little bit about how you choose your stories, how you choose what to focus on. How much of a role do you see yourselves or your work serving in terms of drawing more attention or drawing more support for humanitarian solutions?
Well, the New York Times Code of Ethics actually says that we don't engage in activism. So I think journalism is inherently a qualitative pursuit. I'd like to think that the stories I do have impact and change lives. I can only think of a few instances where I've seen a direct impact. Most of the time the work I do feels like a drop in the ocean, which is kind of heartbreaking and disillusioning most of the time, especially when you're covering hard stories. But it's you craft these narratives and you put them out into the world, and you hope or believe in the notion that those stories kind of share greater truths and connect people, and through that comes positive change or further understanding.
Yeah, I'm glad you said understanding, because I do think that, one of the things I think young journalists in particular in this sort of era when activism and storytelling is so merged, often struggle to sort of process is that certain kinds of journalism, it's not all kinds of journalism, but New York Times journalism is not meant to be activists. And the mission, and I hope I get this right, of the company is, seek truth and help people understand the world.
Yeah.
And so, that's a different mission than trying to spur a certain kind of action. And just to help people understand, well, why is that the case? What are the risks? There were a whole bunch of journalists before the Iraq War who were believers in that war and who were pushing action, and that became very problematic because it in many ways was probably the wrong choice, right? So when you're stepping into that place of telling people what to do, there's enormous risk, and the bigger problem, I think, is that it creates these blind spots where you only see and only present the information that serves the argument that you want to make. And that's why it's riskier for a democracy or for any country to sort of rely on agenda-driven journalism. The only other thing I would say is that what you don't see, but is probably true of many of these photographs, is the close working relationship that happens between journalists and photographers and groups like the Red Cross or the UN.
You're all on the ground beside each other, essentially.
And you're constantly sharing information, and you're saying, I'm noticing this, what are you noticing? And so a lot of the information that, that comes through are people who sort of help as gatekeepers or as informers, and so a lot of journalism around the world in difficult places wouldn't be possible if not for that nexus of people who do care and do want to drive action. But we stop short of dictating solutions. Our goal is to try and just help people understand.
Which is where we did have one question from the audience, and I know this has come up. Oh, sorry.
The only other thing I would add to that is, from a Red Cross perspective, our goal is not to take sides. Right, so similar to the mission of the New York Times, ours is to focus on the consequences, the impact of whatever the humanitarian issue or cause is. So I don't know if many of you know, but we do monitoring of detention centres on Nauru and Manus. It's not something we go around spruiking or sharing because of our impartiality. That gets us in the door to be able to try and advocate for the needs of those people in detention. And so Red Cross does not have a political agenda. It makes no odds what colour you are, what nationality you are, what religion you are, what sexuality you are. We are blind. We should be blind to those things, and our role is to help support where the need is greatest, irrespective of those things. Which is why I think, working with media, it's so important, because our voice, what we can say, what we can share, what we can show is mandated by our fundamental principles for a very, very good reason, I should say. And so you can say and show things that we will never be able to do.
Right.
Yeah, I feel like this really answers a question that one of the students put forward, and I know it has come up in the photography world a lot, which is, do you ever feel the impulse to put down the camera and intervene? Which sort of suggests that taking pictures isn't enough. And what you've just spoken to suggests, you've got to pay adequate attention to the role that increasing understanding and simply sharing information plays. Our lovely students, empathetic, intelligent people as they are, had lots of questions about the impact on you personally of the work that you do. They wanted to know, and I'm going to give you sort of a 5-barrel question here. Feel free to answer which questions you like or none at all. They asked whether what you've witnessed has changed your perspective in life, how you cope personally and professionally with what you've seen, whether you regret any of the work that you've done, and whether you get compassion fatigue.
That's a good question.
That's a good question. I'll let guys go first.
Adam is more recently in these places. I'll let you go first.
This is probably a better question for my partner than me. I mean, the idea of being an observer with a camera is, it's not a valid one. I mean, of course, you're impacted by the things that you see and witness. and I don't think it would be normal if you weren't impacted. I think it's how you choose to process those experiences and kind of move forward with them. I've built my career around not just like jumping from conflict to conflict. When I feel like I've bitten off enough or bitten off more than I can chew, I tend to retract from work, digest that emotionally, and then get back to work when I feel like it's okay. But post-traumatic stress is a real thing. I definitely have colleagues who have seen the pointy end of that experience. As someone that covers a lot of war, I've read a lot about it, and we never really know what the limits of our capacity to experience trauma. An American soldier can be in 100 gunfights and never develop post-traumatic stress, but you can send a guy into one gunfight and he will come out with PTSD. Every time you go, you're a little mindful of that. I've escaped relatively unscathed, but that doesn't mean I haven't kind of felt a kind of darkness in my life after I've been at war. I think more than processing the experience for me, it's the meaning you attach to the story that you've told. I definitely, in all my kind of trips to Afghanistan, I've been on assignment for the New York Times about 15 or 20 times at this point. I've kind of lost count, and I was recently there for the New Yorker actually. I started to get very unsettled about the narrative that I was participating in. I was making pitches that I wanted to be anti-war, and I realized that once I kind of set those images free, they existed in a kind of larger narrative that could actually be pro-war. And that made me very uncomfortable and actually gave me more stress than, say, witnessing somebody die.
Yeah, interesting. Ditto to everything he said. The only other thing I would add is that a lot of times people talk about the negatives that come from covering these sorts of things, and there are plenty of them. I think you can't do this and not be changed. And the ones who try to fight it are the ones that often end up in worse trouble. But I also think there are real positives. I mean, I think that I remember there was some New York Times journalist who was asked why they keep going to these war zones, and they said, you see the best and worst of human nature every day in these experiences. And there's a lot of the best of human nature too. I mean, there's so many stories, and I get emotional thinking about the people who took me into their home at great risk to themselves to let me tell their story, while someone in Sydney won't give me their name, but that's another issue. There is such bravery that allows journalism to happen that you just feel so proud to have been a part of it. And then I think after you do these sorts of things, everything becomes a little bit easier, and you start to see the problems with oversimplified narratives of solutions. Like everything becomes more complex, and
because everything is complex.
It is more complex, exactly. And so there's a real wisdom that I think comes from it if you let that happen. In addition to the brokenness, which is part of it too.
Look, I'd agree. If I think about our humanitarian aid workers, our nurses that go in to fight Ebola, all of the things that they see, standing side by side with you, trying to help these people, I'm sure it impacts on them in lots of different ways. But the thing that has really struck me is, despite the darkness, humanity does shine through. And human kindness, there is so much of it. Even when you think about it here in Australia, when there's been a flood or a tsunami or there's been a fire or even a large trauma event. So, the incident down Burke Street, the coming together of people from all walks of life who share that common humanity, who really are about people living and letting others live. I think that's the thing that sustains me. Despite all the trouble, despite all the darkness, I think there is hope when there are people who care.
I think on that note, it might be a really good time to open up to the audience and take questions from you guys. Yep. I can see someone who's already keen. I might keep the microphone with these guys, but if anyone who has a question could stand up and project to us so we can make sure that we hear you, that would be great.
I always love hearing this question because for over a year now, I've been talking about Australia's secrecy problem and its lack of transparency. And when I first started talking about this, a lot of other Australian journalists and officials would look at me like I was crazy. And then, after the AFP raids and after a whole bunch of other things, it suddenly became a little bit more obvious. And I do think there are a bunch of structural things that make journalism here really, really difficult. The culture of secrecy and privacy, which is deeply embedded, is very hard to overcome, and it affects everything from a phone call to a police station to find out what happened, to public records requests, to, and this is a big one that people don't often think about, to a lack of independent data that's produced by government or by think tanks or by anything that's sort of independent. So there's just not there's not as much kind of fodder for great impartial journalism in Australia as there is in a lot of other places. And Australia has the luxury of being a comfortable, rich country where most things are solved that are not solved in many countries, whether it's guns or healthcare or retirement funding. So there's a complacency that develops around this stuff that makes it very difficult to create really great journalism. I've worked in more than a dozen countries for the Times. This is one of the hardest countries I've ever worked in to do journalism. Things take longer. It's so hard to get people on the record. Like even statements like, "it is understood," is toxic. Like that idea that not only am I going to not tell you where this anonymous source came from or why I think this information is valid if I can't name them, I'm just going to make it sound like this is just something that fell to me from God.
That everyone agrees on.
Yeah, that everyone agrees on if you're in this insular little club. It's really problematic. And so I do think there's a ton of room for improvement. I'm heartened by the fact that there is a lot more attention to this than there used to be. We've had meals and conversations with people who are on opposite sides of the partisan divide here, whether it's people from the Murdoch press and the Guardian and Fairfax and the ABC, sitting together having conversations about some of these issues. You have things like the Judith Neilson Institute, which has put $100 million into trying to improve journalism in Australia. So I'm actually hoping that this is a bit of an inflection point and that 5 or 10 years from now, we'll be able to look back and say, hey, things got better. But right now, it's a really tough place to do good journalism. And the journalism you see, there's a lot of people who fight through it and do great work, but it's not as common as it could or should be, and a lot of it is not the journalist's fault.
It's a great question. I think, working for the Times or other kind of dominant media organizations, there is a long history which has been dominated by the narratives that are very kind of Western, neoliberal ideas. And the work that I produce, at least, I won't speak for Damien, definitely kind of panders towards those narratives. I think we're in an age now where the conversation is changing very quickly, and it's not okay to keep reinforcing those stereotypes. I've seen the way media organizations are now hiring in particular. There's a very strong push. As of the start of this year, most media organizations in the US hire 50% women and much more people of color. And there's a real trend in getting those people to have ownership over their own stories, or at least infuse their experience into stories which they understand more than, say, a white man from Australia. One of the ways I've got at this, actually not the particular series of pictures that we were talking about, but I'm sure most of you remember the Chibok girls, the 300 schoolgirls that were kidnapped. I went to Nigeria for the Times and made portraits of most of the young women that had been released from Boko Haram. And I had a conversation with them and the university that housed them about how they wanted to be represented before I went. And we made the decision that they would all kind of dress in the fashion that they wanted to. They felt some ownership over the pictures. The whole idea was for them to kind of present this emboldened, kind of beautiful image instead of this kind of victim of this young woman that was kidnapped. So that's one way I've dealt with the issue of like going to someone else's story, is to kind of ask them how they did want to be represented. And I think 5 years ago that wasn't a conversation I would have had. Naively, coming from the education and the news organizations that had kind of given rise to my career, there was a indulgence in feeling like you have authority. But I think that's continually being deconstructed, and I think that's a positive thing.
Yeah. One thing I would add too, I mean, I do think that participation, that's what I was talking about too, in terms of going back to people and making sure that they're participating in the story that's being told about them. But I also think it's important to do coverage that goes beyond those narratives. And I think, you know, like when I was in Mexico, the American perspective on Mexico, which you hear coming out of Donald Trump's mouth quite a bit, is quite limited and reductive, to say the least. That's an understatement. But, you know, I covered immigration. I covered drugs. These were things that were important narratives, not just for the United States, but for Mexico to try and solve. At the same time, I made sure to write about the amazing food and the artists who were producing really fantastic work. And so sometimes it's also about rounding out the portrait. You know, there are some of those narratives that are, you know, based on these perspectives, but I don't think the solution is necessarily not to do them. I think it's to do them better, and then to make sure that that's not the only thing you do.
Yeah.
A little bit. I think it has paved way. I think photography and videography has like given people access to stories that they wouldn't have been able to kind of see firsthand like that. As far as like it enabling like a diversification in like voices, I think one of the fears that I have is that even though now people have the access to tell their own stories, they still look at the dominant narratives, and this is quite interesting in regards to your question, and they mimic those narratives because they feel like that is the correct way to narrate their story, or a story, or be successful at their job. So just because you give a camera to a young woman or a young man in a Nigerian village, that doesn't mean they're going to tell an authentic story which actually has a heightened sense of integrity to their own story. They can also just mimic like a larger narrative that they've seen played out before. So I think it's kind of a double-edged sword.
Yeah, I don't have too much on this besides, you know, I think one of the things photographers that writers, you know, we do too, but the degree to which these guys spend a lot of time with people to allow things to sort of develop, and the intimacy that develops, it takes a lot more work for people to forget the camera's there than to forget that I'm there with a notebook. And so I do think it changes the dynamic, and there are some stories where we'll say, okay, let's go with the photographer, and sometimes I'll go alone and then a photographer will come afterwards. And so like you're constantly trying to figure out what the comfort zone is to create the most authentic story for like whatever medium you're working in. Video is like a whole different thing. People, you know how to perform, and you know, I think that's probably the most challenging thing, to get people to sort of lose themselves and just be their authentic selves when there's a video camera around, or especially if you mention TV, it changes things. I mean, I do think that it's taken me a long time to sort of learn how to do this. I think the great thing about journalism is that passion and persistence is valued. And so, you know, the one thing I would say is that the best thing to do is fight for the story, don't fight for yourself or your ego. And so, you know, when you're arguing on behalf of the story and you know that story so well that your editor, you know, just has to be impressed with and willing to at least listen to your point of view, I feel like that's the most successful way to do it. That said, I'm reminded of, you know, one of my favorite editors who was really wonderful, who when I was in Iraq, I remember I had 2 like hour-long arguments over individual words in a story, and I lost both of them. I've never been able to persuade her. She's always beaten me back. She always had a smarter argument for whatever argument I had. And that's valuable. That back and forth is actually really valuable.
Yeah.
And so you end up with like a sense of mutual respect for that intensity. And I think that intensity is valuable. I mean, I tell, you know, we have a small team here in Australia with a bunch of young Australian journalists, and I'm constantly telling them to fight, to push back, to not assume that the New York Times has all the answers and that the editor on the other end of the line knows the story or knows what the story should be. You're the expert, and you should push for the things that in your gut you feel like you should push for, and don't be ashamed of it. And I don't believe you get fired for that. I think you build respect and authority through passionate defense of great storytelling.
Yeah. Also really good advice for anyone here who's maybe a PhD student who needs to defend their thesis.
Yeah.
Yep, good.
Yeah,
good
I will say
advice.
that Australia is challenging because, you know, like conflict and like Australians I find often retreat into humor when conversations get difficult. So you know, I think sometimes people think I'm just a crazy aggressive American when I'm just trying to be passionate. But so there are cultural differences too. So I don't know. It's, I mean, it's tricky territory, to be honest.
Yeah.
Next question.
Gosh, if only I knew the answer to that.
Yeah.
You know, that is a really complex question, a bloody good question, I should say. Those sorts of images did invoke an emotive response, but there is the issue of desensitizing when you see so much of it. So when you see the carnage through people who are blowing themselves up, you know, people nearly switch off to those types of images because it's just another bomber, you know, another 20 people died. In America, it's just another mass shooting, right? And you know, you could say similarly, when a mass shooting occurs, there's this kind of emotive outpouring for change, but change doesn't occur. And change is very, very difficult. You know, it comes from lots of different areas and lots of different ways. We need different leadership.
Yeah.
I'm not sure I'm supposed to say that, but we, you know, we need a different type of leadership. People are feeling disempowered as an individual, and when you think about movements over time, it's come from people. It's come from an uprising, and I'm not suggesting for an outright rebellion here or a revolution of any sort, but it comes down to us as individuals being able to have a voice, to stand up, to vote differently, to purchase differently, to influence those around you differently.
It's funny, you mentioned mass shootings. I was thinking about when I went to Christchurch to cover the shooting there, I had this weird deja vu experience where there was this memorial to all the people who had been killed, and a bunch of people were taking selfies or just taking pictures of it in the same way that I'd seen in Florida when I'd covered a mass shooting there. And the thing that it sort of struck me at that point is a like and an Instagram photo is not productive. It's not action. And you know, I think that it creates this like this sense. It's like a sugar pill. It makes you feel like, oh, I've got some energy. I've done something. No, it works if you want to get someone fired. Social media is great for getting people fired, and that's not a small thing. There are people who deserve to be fired, and they deserve to be pressured out of position. But changing policy takes a whole lot more than expressing yourself on social media.
Yeah.
And you know, it's one of the things that I worry about as I look at the world and I think about where the state of democracy is, which is frankly not great. There's this idea that, oh, as long as we vote, or the simple things are what we focus on. The really hard stuff is the institutions. And I've seen it in countries that are new to democracy, in countries that are, you know, have democracy for a very long time. At the end of the day, the boring shit actually matters. And you know, I don't know how you get the public to really care about that in a different way, but whether it's migration, whether it's guns, whether all these big issues, you know, there's only so much you can do with, like, you know, say a like or a share. So I think that's something, and I think we're starting to get to that point where we're having that conversation, but in my view, it's too slow. Like that needs to happen faster.
I mean, if you look at the example in Hong Kong just recently, if you think of the mass movement there, you know, there are millions of Hong Kongese people mobilizing, and yet there's no change, right?
Right.
The Chinese government is coming in and enforcing a whole set of rules, surveillance, being able to whip them out of the country for whatever reason. You know, and you wonder at what point does the mass kind of opposition to a rule, when is that going to take effect? Or are we going to get to a point of actual conflict? So when you look at key epochs in time, right, or key points in time where there has been massive change, sadly it's come from bloodshed.
Right.
Or revolution of some sort. And so hopefully in this day and age, though, we can move past the sort of aggressive kind of push for change. So I don't really have the answer for it, and governments don't have the answer for it. I think you said before, is Australia as democratic as we actually think it is? A recent survey showed 60% of Australians do not hold what we would call humanitarian type values. They're either closed-minded, they don't like difference, they're fearful of change, they're fearful of what would be taken from them if it was given to somebody else. They want to protect Australia first, or they're apathetic, right? 60% of adult Australians. Now, had we run that survey 10 years ago, would the results have been different? I don't know. If we run the survey again in 5 years, what would the results look like? I actually think we're at a watershed moment, where we're at that precipice where we either try and achieve change. Climate change is another huge one. When you think about how catastrophic climate change is for every single living thing on this planet, and yet we cannot invoke change. What does it take for humanity to move? I don't have the answer. Did you want to add to that?
You want to take on that hopeful
Do you
note?
have the answer?
Come on, solve it.
I don't have the answer, and I think you guys have answered the question already, but I just wanted to add one thing quickly. You're absolutely right, and I think about this all the time, like, what's the point? What's the point of all those images being made over and over again?
Yeah.
Pardon? Oh, no problem. No problem. But I think it's equally important to flip the question and kind of think, what would our world look like if those pictures weren't getting made or those stories weren't being told over and over again?
Yeah.
That's it.
Can I ask you guys a question?
Sure.
Sure. Uh-oh.
And so I think, the media, you have such a pivotal role to play, and you're in such a unique position. And I just wonder, you two have come across as really stand-up type dudes with really strong ethics. You think about your audience, you think about the story you're telling, and you talk about the authenticity of it and keeping true to that kind of objectivity, although you said that was shit.
Well, objectivity.
Objectivity.
Yeah. Authenticity is real.
I don't know if this is wrong or right of me to say, but there's quite a few of your colleagues who don't have these same standards.
Totally good question. Yeah. I
And
know where you're going.
what is it that we do, or that you do, or that your industry does to kind of rein it back in? Because the damage that is done, that feeds into the fear of people, the prejudice of people. In part, that's how Trump's there. Brexit has occurred.
Yeah.
What kind of constraints and controls do you have within your own industry? And are they working?
Well, I don't think that there are. I mean, there aren't many constraints, right? And the constraint, frankly, is the public. And, one of the things I would say is that, there's probably some English majors or literature majors here. Like, when I studied literature, there's a relationship between the text, the author, and the audience. And we often talk about the text and the author, but we don't often talk about the audience. And the reality is that news consumers have a responsibility to choose good sources and to understand the environment that they're working in and to elevate quality over shit, And so I do think that part of the responsibility goes there. That said, I don't want to shirk your question about our industry. I do think there's a lot of people who don't do it a great job and don't do it right. I think, one thing you can do is, I think the New York Times, we don't work with those people. And, I've had situations where you can do things to use the sort of power that the New York Times has to push that away. Again, I'm thinking about Haiti. There was this one street that was on fire after the earthquakes that a lot of freelance photographers went and shot every day. And 99% of that country was at peace and working together, but those were the images that were coming out. And I sent a note to my editors and to the photo editors saying, hey, listen, you're gonna get a whole bunch of stuff coming through from this location. You need to know that this is the anomaly. This isn't normal.
This isn't the whole.
Yeah, this isn't representative. And so you can do things like that to check the bad influences, and I think you have a responsibility sometimes to do that. But otherwise, I don't know. I mean, sometimes I in Christchurch, I was frequently frustrated by fellow journalists who were there and how they were treating people. And I didn't really know what to do. I didn't know if it was my position, if I should call them out. I just made sure I didn't do that. But I think it leads to better journalism if you're not an asshole. But a lot of people don't feel that way. And if you're a TV guy, you have a different set of deadlines than I do. So I don't know. I mean, I'm curious now. What do you think the industry needs, or what would you, in your ideal situation, how would we help solve that problem?
Gosh. I do agree there is a need for the audience to be discerning. The fact is, though, humans are lazy.
Right.
They go to the most immediate source, the most popular source, the source that plays into their own prejudice.
Right.
It's human nature. And so, whilst other people would seek out truth, we know that we are not living in the era of intellectual, kind of factual beliefs, right? We know this. There's a demise in trust in large institutions. I think democracy is facing a really challenging time. Whether democracy still is relevant and salient in today's age, the way it's playing out. I don't know if there's a code of ethics or a code of conduct that all journalists must sign up to. For news agencies, you know, regardless of who they are or where they're placed in the world, do they have a responsibility to make sure that their journalists sign a code of conduct?
Right, and then do they follow it?
And then do they follow it, right? Because codes of conduct,
yeah.
Unless they're enforced, they become a choice. And so this is like a microscopic kind of element of society within journalism that plays out across all of society to some degree.
Yeah, I mean, one other thought I have too is, I mean, one thing I
didn't
think
solve that, by the way.
No, you didn't. I don't think we're going to solve that today. Sorry. But one of the other things that I think that we're trying to do is cover the dynamics that lead to this more. You know, there's a lot more coverage in the New York Times about the way social media distorts information and creates these echo chambers and creates problems, and that's because the Times has made that a priority. So I do think that there are ways to just give the readers and give the audience, hey, this is what's really going on. That's one way I think you can do it. But I also think, you know, it's easy to sort of blame journalists, and this is why I have a hard time sort of calling people out. But at the end of the day, it's about the journalistic leaders. It's the people at the top of the mastheads that need to be held accountable.
Yes, I agree.
And, you know, I think if you had, you know, even the politicians, if the politicians actually, you know, and this is true both in the US and in Australia, if they actually had a little deeper respect for journalism and abided by their own ethics of, say, transparency and serving the public interest a little bit more often, it might be easier. Like, this whole thing is an ecosystem, and journalists are just one part of that ecosystem.
Correct.
And so, you know, everybody has a responsibility to try to make it better.
Yeah, I'd agree with that.
You know, questions there and there. Yeah, sorry.
I think because we've run over time quite a bit, we do have an afternoon tea to serve and we can continue this discussion. I just wanted to say, whatever the solution is, I think discussions like this are a very, very important starting point. And they give us a recognition of how important this exhibition is as well, because it's not just a gallery full of interesting pictures. It's an opportunity to respond and to discuss, and we all have the responsibility to do that. Equally appreciative to our amazing panel of speakers, as I am to the audience. Thank you for coming. Thank you for your very intelligent questions and your engagement. And like I said, I know there's a couple of questions that have gone unanswered, but we do have an afternoon tea to enjoy, and I really encourage you to keep talking to each other and to continue this discussion and explore the exhibition and respond to it further. Can you please join me in thanking Damien, Adam, and Cecilia for their time?
What a pleasure.
Yeah, it was great. I would love to see that survey.
Thanks so much, Cecilia. Thank you.
Yeah, I ran it in 2018.
Thanks, Aaron.
I want to use my card because I'm that, like...
Thank you. That was great.
I won't release it.
Yeah, it was really good.
But I'm happy
Thank
to talk
you.
to it. But,
They won't release it.